So in this new airbrush painting lesson, we're going to be working on another portrait. As you can see in this one, we're going to be working on a male portrait, this time with facial hair and a pretty thick beard. So I'm going to show you a bunch of different techniques that I use to paint this. I'm not going to include any sort of art history lesson in this one. We're just going to get right into the painting. So if you're going to paint along with me to use this to learn from, up on the screen now, I'm placing an image of my completed painting. This is a high resolution photo, and of course this video is in 4K. So what I recommend doing is placing this video in full screen, take a screenshot of this, and then you could use this as a reference to paint along with. And because I know that not everyone owns a printer, I set up a gridded version here in Photoshop, so you could use this to transfer over to your paper or to your canvas. So hopefully this will save a step, that way you don't have to print it out and draw a grid on it. So first let's start by mixing a basic flesh tone. Now I'm going to be using transparent paints, meaning that we're going to be erasing into these paints to get our highlights. So the first color I'm using here is orange, and this is made by Createx Illustration Colors. As you can see, I added a good amount here, about 50, maybe 60 drops of orange. I want this paint thinner, so in order to reduce it, I'm using distilled water. I'm adding about 20% to this. If you watch my video on mixing flesh tones, you'll understand what we're doing here. But what we need to do is desaturate this orange. So in order to do that, we're using the complementary color, which is blue. The blue that I'm using is called cobalt blue. And just to start out, I added just a few drops into this to see what it looks like. So after this is mixed up, I could already tell that this is still too orange. So I'm going to add a few more drops of that blue into the mixture to help desaturate it further. Now, when you're mixing any sort of colors, especially something like flesh tones, you can never think of this as a formula. It's not a good idea to think of color mixing like this, like, oh, 10 drops of orange, 2 drops of blue is going to give me a perfect flesh tone every time. It really doesn't work like that. So many variables can affect your final color mixture, even simple things like you didn't mix one of your bottles well enough, or maybe your cobalt blue is mixed slightly differently than my cobalt blue from the factory. Paint brands are pretty consistent with their mixtures, but I've seen over the years many times where a bottle or a tube of paint is slightly different than the last tube of paint. So all that you want to understand here is that we're using two colors, orange and blue, to mix our flesh tone. I started out with a good amount, about 50 drops of orange, and then I added to that, let's say around 10, maybe 15 drops of blue, and that way we desaturate it to get a muted orange color. After spraying this color on a blank piece of paper, I'm laying it right next to my reference photo to compare the colors. This looks close enough to me, so this is what I'm going to use to start my painting. One tip that I want to give you that I do sometimes is when I'm using a color mixture like this, if the final color still has too much of an orange hue to it, you can add a few drops of burnt umber to this mixture, maybe 3-4 drops of it, and that's going to help desaturate it further. Just like all my other paintings, this one is on smooth canvas that I prepared myself. Whatever surface you're working on, you want to make sure that you have at least 1 or 2 layers of a high quality gesso on there so you could use the same techniques that I'm using. This gesso is going to give you the option to soft erase into your paint, so you can have a lot more control while you're working on this one. So to start this painting, I'm starting with the left eye, and on the left side of the screen, you could see my completed painting just so you can see what we're working towards. The color in my airbrush right now is the color we just mixed. I'm spraying here at 20 PSI using an Iwata Custom Micron Takumi. So with my shield, you can see that I just sprayed in that line that separates the lower eyelid from the iris. And for the right side of the iris, I'm using just a part of my shield to spray this in. Now, when you're working on irises, that's the center part of the eye, the colored part, sometimes you're going to see on people that there's a darker ring along the outside. This is very common in infants and children, and as we get older, it tends to fade a little bit, but this darker ring is called the limbus or the limbal ring. And basically what it is like the color of the iris itself kind of transitions to a darker, almost black color on the outside. Like I said, you're not going to see the limbal ring in every single portrait you work on, but it's something you definitely want to pay attention to. And it's always going to be on that transition where the pigment part of the iris transitions to the sclera, and the sclera is the whites of the eyes. After we have a few of those sharper lines added in, I'm switching over to freehand and basically just spraying in the iris itself. And while I'm doing this, I'm looking at my reference, trying to pay attention to where I see some darker areas. As you can see on the left side of the screen, that it's a little darker up toward the top where that upper eyelid is casting a shadow on it, and then it tends to get lighter in the middle where the iris is pigmented. One thing I'm trying to do is not to add too much paint to this really bright highlight on the right side of the iris, basically just to the right of the pupil. This is a specular highlight, and a specular highlight is a highlight that's directly reflecting the light source. If you watched my lesson on painting metal, where I did a small still life of a hammer, I talked about the effects that you need to paint in order to make realistic looking metal, and that's all about high contrast of darks and lights. Now, the eye is a wet surface, so it's going to reflect light very similar to the way that metal would. So what we want to do here is we want to make sure that this specular highlight is very bright, right next to these very dark colors. You could see to the left of it, we have that very dark pupil, which is basically pure black. And to the right of it, we have that limbal ring. So just like the metal painting lesson, we want to have this very high contrast to create the illusion that this looks like a shiny surface, a wet surface, and it's reflecting the light. So once I have the color down, I always switch back to the eraser to start cleaning some things up. You can see here I'm using a stick eraser, and I'm using this to lighten up the center part of the iris. I'm also using a shield here to spray in the limbal ring on the left side. As you can see there, some of that paint got in an area I didn't want it to be, so it's really easy to clean up with this technique. I just use my eraser and erase it right out. Switching back to my airbrush, I'm going to glaze some of this flesh tone right back over the eye to help darken it up. When I was erasing, I'm able to control how much paint I pull out by how much pressure I use. That's why I really like painting on gesso. It allows you to do this and just gives you some more control. Now, a common mistake that I make all the time is that I'll erase too much. I'll just use too much pressure on that eraser. It's never a big deal. Just switch right back over to your color and spray it back on to darken it up. To paint in the pupil, I'm using a small circular shield that I made myself, and the color I'm using here is black. I'm pretty happy with the layout right now. Everything looks like it's in the right place. So what I'm doing is using this black to darken some areas up. You can see on the right side here, I'm just working on darkening up that limbal ring. And then also I'm going to switch over to freehand and start widening up this pupil. While I'm making the pupil larger, I'm also slightly softening the edges around it to make it look a little bit more natural. Spraying black through an airbrush is very unforgiving. You just want to be careful not to spray too much of it because you could easily spray way too much and make it way darker than you want it to be. So remember, always spray less paint, step back from it, see what it looks like, and then if you need to, darken it up with some more. To push that realistic look a little more and make this eye look like it's reflecting light, I'm switching over to an X-Acto blade here, and I'm pulling out a very thin highlight just below the iris where it connects to the lower eyelid. An X-Acto blade works really well for this because it pulls out a nice thin line, and you can see I'm just going slowly just to pull out a few little bits of paint right at the bottom. And while I was painting freehand, some of the overspray got onto this specular highlight, so I'm switching to my electric eraser here, and I'm just tapping out some really bright areas right in the center of this highlight. Even though a specular highlight is directly reflecting the light source, it's always going to have subtle gradients and transitions in it. So you can see that using my different tools here, I'm able to adjust the values within this highlight. It's really bright right in the center. That's where I use the electric eraser. And as it fades out, it's still bright, but it's slightly darker than that really bright white center. And once I have everything in like this, now I just start adjusting things. So you'll see I'm switching between my airbrush and my eraser, darkening some areas that seem too light, and then using my eraser to scratch out any highlights that I think are needed. While I'm painting one part of the portrait like the eye, it's the only part of the painting I'm thinking about. I'm not thinking of anything else. I'm just looking at my reference and thinking of this eye as one single painting. And eventually, as you start doing that, you start working from one eye to the eyebrow or to the nose, and you basically just build up block by block to kind of put it all together at the end. When you break down parts of the portrait like this, it makes the whole painting process a little bit easier on yourself. It's less scary, it's less daunting. You just work on that one part knowing that each part is going to slowly build up to give you a final portrait in the end. When you're painting a portrait of anyone, if you pay attention to what you see, you'll notice that the sclera, which are the whites of the eyes, are never pure white. Of course, we know that the eye itself is a sphere, so that's going to reflect light just like any other sphere in nature. And the light source on this one is over to the right. So bright highlights are going to be on the right, shadows are going to be off to the left. So on this eye, the sclera to the left of the iris is going to be darker. So what I'm doing right now is just using my flesh tone to start out here. And I'm just laying in a very thin layer of paint off to the left, giving us a gradient where it's really dark over to the left where it meets the corners of the eyelids. And then as it gets closer to the center of the eye where the iris is, it gets a little bit lighter. So with this flesh tone in my airbrush, I want to add some of these small creases on the upper eyelid So as you can see here, what I'm doing is I'm using a ripped piece of paper and then I'm just lightly spraying along the edge of it. While I'm doing this, I'm kind of focusing my airbrush upward more toward the paper, spraying a little bit more on the paper, letting some of that overspray just get onto the canvas underneath, and that's going to help give us a very thin, soft transition. Of course, this is still going to be a sharp line because we're using a shield, a ripped piece of paper, but if you focus more of your spray on the paper and let the overspray get onto the canvas, that sharp line is going to be a little bit softer if you just spray directly along the edge. Before I add any more paint here, I want to get this thin crease just above the upper eyelid in. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a shield, and when you're using any sort of airbrush shield, it's never going to fit the curve of the line perfectly. So the way to get around this is just to paint in one part of it and then move, adjust your shield, and then spray in the rest. If you just kind of work your way around a whole curve like this and just spray in small areas, you can get it to look like this where it looks pretty much seamless. In my reference, I see a small crease to the left of the eye, so I'm using a ripped piece of paper just to spray that in, then switching over to freehand to darken up the left side here of this upper eyelid. I'm not at all concerned if any of that overspray gets into the whites of the eyes. The color in the whites of the eyes is wrong now anyway. It still looks a little bit too orange, too reddish. We'll adjust that later with a different color. I'm going to start adding in some of these eyelashes on the upper eyelid, and the tool I'm using for this is a colored pencil. This one is made by Prismacolor, and the line is called Very Thin. As the name would imply, you can sharpen these just with a normal pencil sharpener down to a pretty thin, sharp point, so it works well if you're trying to get in small details like eyelashes. While I'm doing this, I'm trying to get these in basically the right places, but I'm not concerned with trying to get these perfect yet. You'll see later that I'll be erasing into these, so we're going to lose a lot of them, but it's a good idea just to kind of map them in place now, just so we know where we're going. I'm using my skin texture template just to add some small dots and some texture to the left side of this upper eyelid, and then also using a ripped piece of paper just to add in some of these small creases before I switch over to freehand and start darkening this up. If you accidentally spray too much paint here like I did, all you need to do is switch back over to the eraser and just start lightening some areas up. Again, this is one of the reasons that I love painting on any gessoed surface like gessoed canvas. It just gives you so much more control. If any of these lines are too dark, you could basically just erase right over the top of them using subtle pressure, not too much, and the line will still be there. It'll just be softer. If you're using a traditional synthetic airbrush paper, let's say like a Yupo paper made by Legion, you really don't get this option. When you erase with that, it's basically all or nothing. The paint comes out so easily. That's excellent for a bunch of techniques. So many airbrush artists use that. I find it a little bit less forgiving, so I just prefer gesso just to give me those options to soft erase. From here, what I'm doing is observing, looking at my reference, trying to adjust things. You can see we're in kind of a messy stage right now. Everything's not, really cleaned up or anything. That's okay. We're going to start defining things later on. We just want to get everything in place and start slowly building up values. If you're uncomfortable using a shield, you could do what I'm doing here by placing a small amount of Frisket onto the canvas. As long as you let the paint dry for a few minutes, you could place this right over it, and you don't have to worry about it peeling up the paint when you remove it. Frisket's always going to give you a very sharp line, so as I put this on, I tried not to spray too much paint, and you can see right there, we get a pretty sharp crease there, just above that upper eyelid. For this part of the painting, I'm switching over to the color Sepia, which is a more neutral color, and it's cooler than the flesh tone that we mixed. For me, the easiest and quickest way to add in sharp lines is to always use a shield like I'm using here, but I understand that some newer painters aren't comfortable using shields yet, so the Frisket works as a great alternative. Remember that there's no right way to paint. You could paint any way you like. If you're watching my videos, please don't think that I'm saying this is the only way. We all think differently and we all have different approaches to painting. For me, this is the way that I just found easiest and works best for my style over the years. So make sure you experiment, look at other lessons, look at other artists, and try to incorporate everything you learn to build up your own painting style. For me, painting has always been just a different type of drawing, using brushes and colored pigments rather than graphite or charcoal. And over the years, I found out that an airbrush is the closest painting material to actual drawing. So this is one of the reasons I love it. You're really doing the exact same thing as you would if you're drawing with, traditional pencils and graphite. It's all about adding some color, some pigment down, and then using an eraser to remove it. The white and the highlights always come from the surface. So in this case, the lights are coming from a gessoed canvas. And in a lot of my videos, people ask me where I learned to airbrush, and I didn't. I never took any sort of formal airbrush painting lessons or really lessons from anyone. What I did was I learned how to draw. And once you know how to draw, you could basically do it with anything. You could switch over to acrylic paints and brushes, traditional oil paint, or an airbrush. And at the end, it's really all the same thing. And although the materials and the approach are different for different mediums, you're doing the same thing every single time by adding values where they need to be. And of course, learning to paint, draw, or airbrush in this style where we're representing reality, that's all about observation. So make sure you learn to pay attention to what you see and continually practice, either from life or from photographs. I'm going back to my flesh tone here, and I want to sharpen up this line on the inner part of the upper eyelid. So just place my shield there, spray a small amount of paint to give me that sharp line. When you're painting any sort of portrait, you'll notice that the majority of it is kind of soft lines and soft transitions, except for the areas around the eye like that I'm working on right now. You'll see that there's a lot of sharp angles and lines here, especially right around the iris and where the eyelids connect to the eye itself. From here, I want to add in some of that lower eyelid. So I use the shield first to define it, just like the upper eyelid. And then I'm coming around with an eraser, lightening this up. And I'm also erasing into the sclera just to lighten the left side of it where it gets close to that limbal ring. The area around the tear duct on the right gets pretty dark along with this upper eyelid, so I sprayed in some more paint there, and then I'm switching over to an X-Acto blade just to pull out some very thin, bright highlights. That's going to make it look like some water in there, some moisture that's reflecting the light. Switching over to the electric eraser, I'm just tapping in some small dots here to make it look like some skin texture and some pores off to the right. You can see right now, compared to the reference photo, that these are way too bright. Again, just like before, we're going to go back to our flesh tone and spray it over the top. What's good about that is that texture will remain, but we'll darken the values up. Anytime I'm using any sort of eraser on my paintings, whether it's a stick eraser or an electric eraser, I usually know that I'm going to most likely pull it out too bright, or that highlight's going to be brighter than I want it to be. So I just always know that that's going to be okay. I'll just glaze some color over the top to darken it later. Switching over to the airbrush freehand, I'm still using that flesh tone that we mixed. And I just want to spray in the right side here so we can start defining this shadow, basically a cast shadow up here for the left side of the nose. If you work on portraits, you'll see pretty quickly that this curve here generally curves right up to the eyebrow line. So you can see that cast shadow on the left side of the nose. I just kind of continued it up to the lower part of the eyebrow. And then from here, we have something to work into, so we can erase and we can start scratching out some highlights to define some of the hairs within the eyebrow. Before we get to the eyebrow, I want to finish the lower part of this eye so we have it in place. And the first thing I'm doing is using a ripped piece of paper that I just kind of ripped a curve in and lightly spraying over it to get this very thin line. I did this before I applied any paint to this area. That way, if there's any mistakes, it's much easier to erase out. So just place these in around the side. You can see that there's some small shadows and some curves here right underneath this the tear duct. So I place those in too with the shield. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the airbrush freehand and start glazing some color over this whole area and kind of define the angles and the curves underneath the eye. Another way to add skin texture like I'm doing right here is just by spraying in a bunch of small dots freehand. Since there's no shield used for this, these lines are going to be very soft because the airbrush is atomizing the paint. So you can kind of switch off between using an airbrush shield and just spraying a bunch of dots freehand to kind of alter and add randomness to your skin textures. I'm darkening up the small crease under the eye, just doing this freehand. This is going to help break it up so that line width doesn't look the same all the way around. You can see on the right side now, I sprayed some more paint there so it's a little bit wider, and then it gets thinner as it gets to the middle. In nature or in anything organic, you're almost never going to have perfectly straight lines. So if you could add some randomness to it, always try to do that. Try to break up that uniform look just to make it look more natural. I'm adding in the eyelashes on the lower eyelid with a black colored pencil. And you can see I'm just going around the tear duct here to sharpen up some of these dark shadows inside it. If you ever have to add a very small shadow in like I did for these eyelashes and that area around the tear duct, I recommend trying a colored pencil. Of course, you could use a detail airbrush like a Sotar 2020 or a Micron, but sometimes it's just so much easier to use a colored pencil or a very small paintbrush with some black paint on it. So make sure you're not always tied to your airbrush. The airbrush is great for a lot of things, but other tools are also useful as well. With that flesh tone still in the airbrush, I'm going to work my way along the lower part of this eye and just darken up some areas, add some texture if I need it. And of course, while I'm doing this, I'm looking at my reference. I'm trying not to make anything up. I'm just looking at what I'm seeing and doing the best I can to replicate it. And of course, when you're spraying freehand like this, you're always going to get some overspray in some areas you don't want it to. So I have to clean up this thin little highlight between the iris and the lower eyelid. So you can see I'm just using my X-Acto blade to scratch out and clean up some of these areas. When you're working with an airbrush, you're always going to have overspray. So instead of trying to cover everything up, I learned to just kind of accept it. So I know if I have a bright highlight, like the specular highlights in the eye, I know as I continue along with the painting areas around it, that overspray is always going to get on those areas. So what I just kind of tell myself is remember that at the end of the painting or after I finish that section, I'm going to have to go back in with my eraser or X-Acto blade and erase those areas back out again. For me, I found out that it's a good habit for me to develop, that I'm not always fighting overspray. I just kind of accept it's one part of an airbrush that you have to deal with, but again, it's not that big of a deal. So after we have that paint in underneath the eye, I'm switching over to a stick eraser and then just erasing out some highlights. You can see that as I'm doing this, I erased a lot of the eyelashes I put in. I knew that was going to happen. That's not a big deal. All I have to do is switch back over to the colored pencil later on and redraw them back in. But let's say you don't have any colored pencils or you only want to stick with an airbrush. You could do what I'm doing here. I took a small piece of Frisket and then I just cut out a very thin curve in it. All I did was use a normal X-Acto blade to cut out this curve. And what's nice about the Frisket is it's slightly tacky, so I could place it where I want on the eyelid and just lightly spray in a thin eyelash using some black paint. This technique is definitely slower than using a colored pencil or a small paintbrush, but this is going to give you some more control because you can cut out these eyelashes any way you want. You can make them wider, thinner, longer. And then once you're happy with it, you could just place them in along the eyelid and lightly spray them in. And while you're spraying them too, you could adjust the value. If you spray more paint, you're going to have darker eyelashes. And if you spray less, you're going to have lighter ones. And of course, this goes back to the idea that I was talking about earlier, that there's no one way or no right way to paint. It's always a good thing to experiment and try different techniques. I know I'm doing this all the time. A thing that's great about it is these stay in your memory. You know, you don't forget them. So as you're working on something more difficult, maybe a more difficult portrait in the future, you have these tools at your disposal. And of course, having more options in painting is always a good thing. Before I paint the right eye, what I'm doing is just working my way around this eye, just the area surrounding it, adding in some textures and adding in some value. This way the eye is kind of seated in place. We know that the eyebrow is going to be above it, and we just have some of the flesh tones mapped in around the outside. Of course, we're going to be painting this later, spending a lot more time on it when we're working on the cheek and the nose. But for now, it's a good idea just to get some color on there to cover up some of that white canvas. I'm not going to paint this upper eyebrow just yet, but what I'm going to do now is just freehand, spray in some very thin lines, some thin hairs, just to kind of set it in place. This way, it's going to help guide me as I work on the next eye. Another way to keep a specular highlight really bright is to do what I did here. You could see that I just place a small piece of Frisket in the center of the eye, and then I'm painting this eye just like I did the last one. I'm using the same flesh tone that we mixed in the beginning of the video, and when I remove the Frisket, you can see that we get a very bright highlight. This was just too bright for me, so I'm spraying over it, just darkening the areas around it to make it look similar to the left eye. I'm going to speed through this right eye because the techniques used in this are really the same as the left eye. And this video is already getting longer than I want it to be just for the first part of this lesson, so I'm going to have to speed up a few parts to just condense all this. And just to recap, I only used 3 colors for the whole part of this painting. We used the flesh tone that we mixed in the beginning of the video. That was for almost 90% of the painting. And then some areas that I wanted a little bit darker, I used some sepia. And then finally, for the really dark areas like the pupil, the limbal ring, and the eyelashes, I just used some black. And of course, the other tool is the black colored pencil, which I love for just thin hairs, basically eyelashes and those thin lines that I sketched in for the eyebrow. For the eyebrows, I'm just using a ripped piece of paper that has a thin line in it, just trying, again, another technique to add in some thin lines. I wasn't really that happy about that, so I switched over to freehand, painted in some thin lines with the airbrush, and then switched over to an X-Acto blade to scratch out some highlights. And using these techniques along with the colored pencil like I'm doing now, adds a lot of variety into the eyebrows, into the hair. And this is what we want. We always want to try to add some randomness into areas like eyebrows, because if we get them too sterile and too linear, they're just going to look fake. They're not going to look realistic. But we'll talk about this more in next week's video as we continue along with this painting. So that's where we're going to wrap up the first part of this portrait painting lesson. I want to say thank you to all of you who help support the channel, and thank you so much to all you new subscribers. And of course, I want to thank the generous support from those of you who joined as members to this YouTube page. That includes Andrew, M. Shibley, and Dwayne, all of which have been Tier 2 members for 4 months. Alex as a generous Tier 3 for 2 months. And of course, Robert, Ken, and Pete, all of which have been members for 1 month. So that's very nice of you guys, and thank you so, so much. So in next week's video, we're going to continue with what you're seeing now. We'll work on the nose, the mouth, the beard, and we'll start pulling everything together. I hope this one was helpful and you learned something. Of course, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.